Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are moving on to Journal Collection number 51. This dates from the year 1860, and Emerson will turn 57 this year. This particular journal collection begins with a Latin quotation here, which is translated into English, which I will read now. Footnote. This may be freely rendered, my own right hand, my cupbearer shall be. End of footnote. Editor's note. On January 12th, Mr. Emerson made a short speech at a meeting held in Salem to raise money for the relief of the family of John Brown. His speech is printed in Miscellanies. It is probable that his bold words on this occasion and in the preceding months interfered with his invitations to lecture, and that from Philadelphia was withdrawn. However, a Chicago correspondent wrote him, quote, "The West is in insurrection to hear Ralph Waldo Emerson this season," end quote, and a tour was accordingly arranged in the states of New York, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois. Also, one or more lectures in Toronto. Some 25 lectures were given between the middle of January and the middle of February. He went to Canada again in March and read in Montreal Poetry and Criticism. Also in March he read his lecture Moral Sense to Theodore Parker's Society in the Music Hall. End note. January 16th, 1860. The engineer was goading his boilers with pitch pine knots. The traveler looked out of the car window. The fences passed languidly by. He could scan curiously every post, but very soon the jerk of every pulse of the engine was felt. The whistle of the engineer moaned, short moans, as it swept across any highway. He gazed out over the fields. The fences were tormented, every rail and rider writhed and twisted past the window. The snowbanks swam past like fishes, and the speed seemed to increase every moment. The near trees and bushes wove themselves into colored ribbons, the rocks, walls, the fields themselves streaming like mill race. The train tore on with jumps and jerks that tested the strength of oak and iron. The passengers seemed to suffer their speed. Meantime the wind cried like a child, complained like a sawmill, whistled like a fife, mowed like an idiot, roared like the sea, and yelled like a demon. January 28th. And there's a question mark beside it. At Buffalo, found William B. Wright, my former correspondent from Goshen, New York, and on the way from Rochester to Toronto, J. B. Hunter of Batavia, New York, once of Louisville, Kentucky, and at Toronto saw two Carlyles, nephews of Thomas C. and sons of John Carlyle of Mohawk, Canada West, his brother. Another brother of Thomas Carlyle, Alexander Carlyle, lives at Brentford, and a young sister, Mrs. Hainting, at Hamilton. The young men did not know that their uncle, Dr. John A. Carlyle of London, was named John like their father, but called Dr. John, quote, Uncle Aitken, end quote. One of these young men is teacher of the Model School in Toronto, and the other, I believe, is preparing for the ministry. At Toronto, I had a telegraph from James E. Day inviting me to lecture at the Mechanics Institute, Hamilton, Ontario, but could not go. My correspondent on aesthetics at Toronto is J. D. Edgar, to whom I must write. February 16th. At Kalamazoo, I had a humpback driver who took me to Grand Rapids and back. His name is Church, and his father is a noted lawyer at Syracuse, but this dwarf prefers to be an ostler. He talks to his horses all the way and praises them. "Ha ha, Jimmy, what are you looking after? Ha ha ha. Take care, Jimmy. Saint John. John takes it easy," he says, "but whenever he's called on, he's on hand. Ha ha." He says he slept for years in the same stall with the seed horse, quote, Sir Henry, end quote, which killed its Dutch ostler and was ironed, but Church took the irons off and gave it first and last a barrel of sugar. Flora Temple trotted for a purse of $3,000 at Kalamazoo and made the shortest time ever made in the Union, quote, 2 minutes, 19 seconds and a half, end quote. Quote, she flew, end quote, but he thinks the princess, which was beaten, is the handsomer and the better horse. Ohio, the Buckeye State; Illinois, the Sucker State; Indiana, the Hoosier State; Michigan, the Wolverine State; Wisconsin, the Badger State; Missouri, the Pike State; Iowa, the Hawkeye State. When an Eastern man is cheated by a Hoosier, he is said to be wabashed. Editor's note. Of his Kalamazoo adventure and cross-country ride in bitter cold, Mr. Emerson wrote to his family thus, quote, "At Kalamazoo a good visit, and made intimate acquaintance with a college wherein I found many personal friends, though unknown to me, and one Emerson was an established authority. Even a professor or two came along with me to Marshall to hear another lecture. My chief adventure was the necessity of riding in a buggy 48 miles to Grand Rapids, then, after lecture, 20 more on the return, and the next morning getting back to Kalamazoo in time for the train hither at 12. So I saw Michigan and its forests and wolverines pretty thoroughly." End of note. The postmaster in each of our towns is usually some sneak who reads the administration paper every day and loudly defends the last measure of government. Of course, in its varying policy, he is obliged to eat his words before the year is out. The boys at school call Cicero a regular postmaster. Dr. Jacob Bigelow's formula was that fevers are self-limiting, afterwards that all disease is so, therefore no use in treatment. Dr. Holmes said no use in drugs. Dr. Samuel Jackson said rest, absolute rest, is the panacea. Quote, "Two mandarins, namely Piquet and Tartar General, were in full official costume, and retained throughout that charmed and delighted manner which a Chinaman always puts on when he is powerless and alarmed." When Lord Elgin put these two captured officials into temporary office again after the taking of Canton. Oliphant. 'Tis trite enough, but now and then it is seen with explaining light that nature is a mere mirror and shows to each man only his own quality. Illusions. Color is illusion, you say, but how know I that the rock and mountain are more real than its hue and gleam? Quote, "Pardon me, but the moral impression of Everett's Phi Beta Kappa oration is nothing to Cicero's. Could he with sincerity but once, if only once, have raised his gifted voice to the aegis of our salvation? He would then have better resembled Burke, who descended from a higher sphere when he would influence human affairs." From Aunt Mary's letter of 1825. Quote, "Then for culture can solitude be spared? Solitude, the safeguard of mediocrity, is to genius the stern friend, the cold, obscure shelter where moult the eagle's wings, which will bear one farther than suns and stars. Byron and Wordsworth were burnished their pens. Ah, that you could be disunited from traveling with the souls of other men, of living, breathing, reading, and writing with one livelong time-fated yoke, their opinions." Mary Moody Emerson. Manners. Have manners that can last. As these forms are to be repeated every day, perhaps every hour, nothing exaggerated will last. Any excess, as grimace or affected look or word, becomes intolerable. If a man declines the bread or meat you offer him, with "No, I'm obliged to you," or when he assents to your remark says "Decidedly" or "Exactly," one soon hesitates to give him an opportunity. That the civility reduced to the simplest form, as "Please," "No, thank you," can be spoken 10,000 times with new propriety. The least mistake in sentiment takes all the beauty out of your clothes. Travel, culture. We shall not always travel over seas and lands with light purposes and for pleasure, as we say. Progress of culture will give gravity and domestic rest to the educated classes in this country. April. Somebody said in my hearing lately that a house in Concord was worth half as much again as a house in any other town, since the people had shown a good will to defend each other. The teaching of politics is that the government, which was set for protection and comfort of all good citizens, becomes the principal obstruction and nuisance with which we have to contend. Wherever we look, whether to Kansas or to Utah, to the frontier, as Mexico and Cuba, or to laws and contracts for internal improvement, the capital enemy in the way is always this ugly government. We could manage very well by private enterprise, for carrying the mails, associations for immigration, and immigrant aid, for local police and defense, and for prevention of crime. But the cheat and bully and malefactor we meet everywhere is the government. This can only be counteracted by magnifying the local powers at its cost. Take from the United States the appointment of postmasters and let the towns elect them, and you deprive the federal government of 500,000 defenders. Cassius M. Clay gave Wendell Phillips his audience at New Haven by closing his own agricultural address at 7:30, and at 7:45 went to hear Phillips, advising his hearers to go with him, which they did. So Phillips opened his lecture with some compliment to him, and referred to the fact that Clay had said that, should war break out between the Negroes and the whites, his own part would be taken with the whites. The audience gave 3 cheers for Mr. Clay. "Well," said Phillips, "this then we must reckon the roll call on that side, this distinguished leader and the white population in the slave states." The audience instantly repeated their cheers. Phillips thought himself in a bad plight, but rescued himself by saying, "Well, gentlemen, now let us see the muster on the other side. Thomas Jefferson says that in this contest the Almighty has no attribute, but must take part with the slave. Mr. Clay and the Southern gentleman on one side, and all the attributes of the Almighty on the other." The audience were utterly silenced, and Phillips proceeded with his speech. We are realists through our politics, trade, and geography, and all the intellectual are emancipated. Barbarism lingers with the feeble, the passionate, the unthinking, and they are domineered by the sect of their fathers or their companions. May. The costliest benefit of books is to set us free from themselves also. Classification, a necessity of the human mind and one of its main joys. It masters the mind and makes rogues and thieves of learned men. A professor of theology at Berlin has just been convicted of stealing books from the library of the university. All collectors tend to this foible. W.S. Shaw, the founder of the Boston Athenaeum, used to steal books from the private libraries of his friends, any book he coveted to make his darling Athenaeum complete. Collectors of shells steal orangeas from Mr. Grinnell's mantelpiece and Mrs. Coffin's house at Ciensconset. Mellish Mott told me that the books stolen from the Boston Athenaeum are mostly from the theological department, so that they are forced to lock that up as they do the fine arts alcoves. As an offset to this, Mr. Jewett, the librarian, assured me that the city library, that it was necessary to guard in securest manner the 100 volumes of patent reports sent by the British government for lawyers who had a case requiring the use of one of these books, were utterly reckless, and would borrow and never return, or would cut out the plate or diagram they wanted. Agassiz says, quote, "There are no varieties in nature, all are species." Thoreau says, quote, "If Agassiz sees 2 thrushes so alike that they bother the ornithologist to discriminate them, he insists they are 2 species, but if he sees Humboldt and Fred Cogswell, he insists that they come from one ancestor." Editor's note. Theodore Parker died in Florence in May. Mr. Emerson was asked to speak at the memorial meeting in his honor on June 17th. The following are notes in preparation for that occasion. The address is printed in full in the miscellanies. End note. Religious sects have been displaced by progress of opinion, and traditions have lost their hold on the mind. The dogma of mystic offices being dropped, 'tis impossible to maintain the emphasis of Jesus' personality, and it recedes, as all persons must, before the sublimity of the moral laws. The realization of Christianity is the only way to get rid of it. Theodore Parker has filled up all his years and days and hours, a son of the energy of New England, restless, eager, manly, brave, early old, contumacious, clever. I can well praise him at a spectator's distance, for our minds and methods were unlike. Few people more unlike. All the virtues are solidaires. Each man is related to persons who are not related to each other, and I saw with pleasure that men whom I could not approach were drawn through him to the admiration of that which I admire. The Duc de Branca said, quote, "Why need I read the Encyclopedia? Rivarol visits me." I may well say it of Theodore Parker. 'Tis vain to charge him with perverting the opinions of the new generation. The opinions of men are organic. He was willing to perish in the using. He sacrificed the future to the present, was willing to spend and be spent, felt himself to belong to the day he lived in, and had too much to do than that he should be careful for fame. He used every day, hour, and minute. He lived to the latest moment, and his character appeared in the last moments with the same firm control as in the day of strength. Fault of Theodore Parker, that there was no beauty. What he said as mere fact almost offended you, so bald and detached. Death. When our friends die, we not only lose them, but we lose a great deal of life which in the survivors was related to them. I wrote that one affectation was venial in prosperous men, marked attention to their blood relations. I have discovered another of which I think still better, when people have not common sense, at least to simulate it. If you have only sympathy, you cannot be spared. If you have a finer perception of beauty, he who has a portfolio of designs in his palace becomes soon aware that his portfolio waits for your praise, and he must climb to your garret to obtain it. Pairs. I am a matchmaker, and delight in nothing more than in finding the husband or mate of the trivial fact I have long carried in my memory, unable to offer any reason for the emphasis I gave it, until now, suddenly it shows itself as the true symbol or expression of some abstraction. Advantages of old age. I reached the other day the end of my 57th year, and am easier in my mind than hitherto. I could never give much reality to evil and pain. But now when my wife says perhaps this tumor on your shoulder is a cancer, I say, what if it is? Of friendship. There is not only the unspeakable benefit of a reasonable creature to talk to, but also a certain increase of sanity, through testing one's health by another's and noting the accords and discords. And we appeal pathetically, as Aunt Mary did, when our sanity is questioned, to the certificate of their conversation. Friendship. It is an order of nobility, from its elevations we come. Plutarch, the elixir of Greece and Rome, that is the book which nations went to compose. If the world's library were burning, I should as soon fly to rescue that as Shakespeare and Plato, or next afterwards. Clow says, quote, Plutarch's best life is Antony, I think. God getting tired of kings. Antonio Perez quotes a wise counselor of Philip II, who said to him, quote, should God once get tired of monarchies, he will give another form to the political world. September 11th. Fine walk yesterday with Ellery to Eastbrook Farm. Finest day in the year, and best road almost all the way, through the lots. Birds singing, got over their summer silence, sunlight full of gnats, crickets in full cry, goldfinches, carduleus, on the thistle, eating the seed, scattering the leaves, Boulder Field, Cooper's Hawk, Rock of Sinai, all books and tables of law. Wonderful hedges, barberry, apple, elder, viburnum, ivy, cornel, woodbine, grape, whitethorn. The brook through the wood, benzoin the big birch. Largeness of the estate, nobody can buy. came out at Captain Barrett's, and through the fields again out at Flint's. A cornucopia of golden joys. Ellery says that he and Henry Thoreau have agreed that the only reason of turning out of the mowing is not to hurt the feelings of the farmers, but it never does if they are out of sight, for the farmers have no imagination, and it doesn't do a bit of hurt. Thoreau says that when he goes surveying, the farmer leads him straight through the grass. 'Tis strange, the bluebird's song bring back vividly the cold spring days when we first hear them. Those days were so severe and unlovely, and now seem so sweet. There is one trap into which the most cautious avoider of North Street and Broadway may fall. How unsuspectingly a quiet conservative assembly allows a man to speak to them. They would have called in the police if he had come in with a club, but the moment he opens his mouth, he begins to unseat them, bereaves them of their property, their position, their reasons, their self-respect, to take them out of their possessions and into his, and if he is the man I take him for, they will not soon be their own men again. The poor gentlemen go out of the meeting when this outlaw ends his speech, and rallying to recover their disturbed associations, they fancy that all is as it was when they came, that if they suspected a kind of threat and thunder in this strange harangue, probably the odd things dropped by the speaker were not noticed or understood by most people, and will be forgotten tomorrow. At all events, themselves will forget them as fast as they can, and Faneuil Hall Market, and the Brokers' Exchange, and the banks stand where they did, and will help to blot out these impertinences very soon. Never believe it. Younger people, and stronger than they, heard them also, and, above all, the speaker was very well convinced himself, and is already today taking more outrageous positions, and the speech of men and women, and the fingers of the press are doing their utmost to give his words currency and experiment. Eloquence is forever a power that shoves usurpers from their thrones, and sits down on them by allowance and acclaim of all. The feat of the imagination is in showing the convertibility of everything into every other thing. Now, when I go to the Pyramid, or to Fountain Abbey, or to Stonehenge, I find the sentiment of ancient peoples, their delight in their gods, in the future, their humanity, expressed in this patience of labor that staggered under the toil of hewing and lifting these gray rocks into scientific symmetry. That sentiment of their hope and love touch me, and our associations, which are most pliant and placable, persuade the eye to forget its mathematics, and reconcile its angles and distortions. The rainbow, the sky, Niagara, the rose, a tone of music have in them something which is not individual. Alcott yonder never learned in Connecticut or in Boston what he sees and declares to me, and his face and manners are sublime at times. The wonder of men is that the reason of things comes to my side, molded into a person like myself, and full of universal relations. This power of imagination, the making of some familiar object as fire or rain, or a bucket or shovel do new duty as an exponent of some truth or general law, bewitches and delights men. It is a taking of dead sticks and clothing about with immortality. It is music out of creaking and scouring. All opaque things are transparent, and the light of heaven struggles through. October 9th. Henry James thinks the upper powers don't care so much for talent now as once. It was once the great point to civilize and lead by these gods of the mind. Now they are putting the material activities right, to sustain and order the masses of life. Perhaps the Fourierists have had a reaction upward. Chacun à son tour. He talked well about Louis Napoleon, who is absolute master of all the crowned heads, because he has the revolution in his hand, and can at any time cry, "Hist, boy!" to the dogs and pull them all down. And he knows that England is necessary to him, and has no thought of breaking with it, but likes the prestige which these great crybabies in England by their terror give him with the French and with Europe. Then of science, Manzel's limits of knowledge. The blunder of the savants is to fancy science to be a finality, that it contains and is not contained, but a scientific fact is no more than the scratching of a nail if it stops. All the life of it is in its relatedness, its implication of the all. Only the poetic savant is right, for it is not as a finality, but as a convertibility into every other fact and system, and so indicative of first cause, that the mind cares for it. The games of Greece were in the interest and honor of manhood. They called out every person, virtue, and talent. Ho, every one who can wrestle, run, lift, ride, fight, sing, narrate, or so much as look well. Imagination transfigures so that only the cosmical relations of the object are seen. The persons who rise to beauty must have this transcendency. The calm sky hides all wisdom and power and beauty. That haughty force of form, vis superba forme, which poets praise, this is that, under calm precise outline, the immeasurable and divine. It is as if new eyes were opened so that we saw under the lilac bush, or the oak, or the rock, or the tiger, the spiritual cause of the lilac, oak, stone, or tiger, the genius of that kind, and so could rightly and securely use the name for truth it stood for in the human mind. And still again, under this genius, its origin in a generic law, and thence its affinities to cosmical laws, and to myriads of particulars, and then again deeper causes below, and so on ad infinitum. But I do not wish to find that my poet be not partaker, or that he amuses me with that which does not amuse him. He must believe in his poetry. Homer, Milton, Hafitz, Herbert, Swedenborg are heartily enamored of their sweet thoughts. Wordsworth too. October 20th. We heard across the bay 30 miles where the surf of the open ocean was pounding the land. In looking at the Swiss landscapes, one thinks of the heroes. Rich Europe, rich in men, Themistocles has strictly applied himself to the sea and land of Salamis, and each European hero to the rivered and mountained land. Bonaparte must equal the material problem, must carry all these Swiss angles, these Rhine and Danube waterlines, Mediterranean bays, and impregnable Magdeburg, Olmütz, and Koblenz, or whatever fortress. The Italian quadrilateral, the warlike populations, the bloodlines too, or races that easily unite, and those that instinctively disjoin and quarrel. He must have Europe in his head before he can hold Europe in his hand. Yet these are but rude pioneers and camp guides to break ground and make way for the truer and finer European who must follow, with a grander map of Europe in his brain, as carpenter and mason build a palace which, when they have given up the keys, they enter no more. The most important difference in criticism is whether one writes from life or from a literary point of view. 'Tis difficult for a writer not to be bookish and conventional. If he writes from manly experience and feeling, his page is a power. October. Subjects. Hospitality looks like a good title. The hospitality of manners is so vital. Hospitality of mind so diverse in men. Hospitality over nationality. Hospitality in the Arabs. Le Grand Desert. Damas. Michelangelo. In 1540, Francesco di Olanda, miniature painter in the service of the King of Portugal, visited Rome and saw there Michelangelo, as well as Vittorio Colonna. His manuscript journal was discovered by Count Razinski in Lisbon. Grimm uses a French translation of this. It seems that the manuscript cannot now be found in Lisbon Library, and Count Razinski is believed to be a liar. The memorabilia of philosophy are Plato's doctrine of reminiscence, Berkeley's ideal world, Socrates' interpretation of the Delphian oracle. Then there is a Greek quotation here with no translation. And Tennyson's use of it in Elaine. Quote, "Me you call great, mine is the firmer seat, the truer lance, but there is many a youth now crescent, who will come to all I am, and overcome it, and in me there dwells no greatness, save it be some far-off touch of greatness to know well I am not great. there is the man. The quote-unquote dance of Plotinus. Editor's note. Quote, for the soul of the world stands, as it were, over its body and orders it to abide. But here the elements secretly, as it were, withdrawing themselves, are bound in their proper order by a secondary bond. In the former case, however, they have no place into which they can fly. Hence it is neither necessary to contain them internally, nor by external compression to impel them inwardly, but each remains where nature from the first intended it should remain. And if any one of them is naturally moved, those things to which motion is not natural are affected by it. The bodies, however, which are naturally moved, are moved in a beautiful manner, as being parts of the whole, but certain things are corrupted in consequence of not being able to sustain the order of the whole. Just as if in a great dance, which is conducted in a becoming manner, a tortoise being caught in the middle of the progression, should be trod upon, not being able to escape the order of the dance, though if the tortoise had arranged itself with the dance, it would not have suffered from those that composed it. End quote. End of note. Doctrine of absorption. Nirvana, the Greek saying that the soul is absorbed into God as a phial of water broken in the sea. Like can only be known by like. Heraclitus. Then there is a Latin quotation, and actually 3 of them, and they contain their translation in the footnotes, which I will read. The first states, he only who is one with the gods can feel the God. The second states, search not beyond thyself. The third, nature is in leasts, and that last one is by Aristotle. Hunger and thirst after righteousness. Kingdom of God cometh not by observation, is received as a little child. Christianity, pure deism. God considers integrity, not munificence. Socrates. Imagination. Quote, names, countries, nations, and the like are not at all known to those who are in heaven. They have had no idea of such things, but of the reality signified thereby. Swedenborg, Arcana 2, page 9. Plotinus says of the heavens, quote, there, however, everybody is pure, transparent, and each inhabitant is as it were an eye. Like. Note our incessant use of the word. Like a pelican pecking her breast to feed her young, like a horse always at the end of his tether. Athens, which has lost her young men, is like a year without a spring. The mind in conversation is perpetually provoked to see how all things reflect or image her momentary thought. Whenever this resemblance is real, not playful, and is deep or pointing at the causal identity, it is the act of imagination. If superficial, and for entertainment, it is fancy. Success. I have always one saw to say, and never get it rightly said. It is that if you work at your task, it signifies little or nothing that you do not yet find orders or customers. Dr. Rimmer wishes, quote, to make a statue which will not be bought, end quote. Stories agreeable to the human mind. Pindar and his customer, Sigurd and Eystein, Time, the Little Grey Man, Pied Piper, Behringer's Minotria de Moudon, Oriental Story and Tholuck, Orpheus, Ring of Gyges, Fortunata's Cap, Aladdin's Lamp, Transmigrations of Indra, Seven Sleepers, The Thawed Tune, Solomon and the Scepter. November 15th. The election. The news of last Wednesday morning, the 7th, was sublime, the pronunciation of the masses of America against slavery. And now on Tuesday, the 14th, I attended the dedication of the Zoological Museum at Cambridge, an auspicious and happy event, most honorable to Agassiz and to the state. On Wednesday, 7th, we had Charles Sumner here at Concord in my house. Yesterday eve, I attended at the Lyceum, in the town hall, the exhibition of stereoscopic views magnified on the wall, which seems to me the best and most important application of this wonderful art. For here was London, Paris, Switzerland, Spain, and at last Egypt, brought visibly and accurately to Concord for authentic examination by women and children who had never left their state. Cornelius Agrippa was fairly outdone, and the lovely manner in which one picture was changed for another beat the faculty of dreaming. An odd incident of yesterday was that I received a letter or envelope mailed from Fraser, Pennsylvania, enclosing no letter but a blank envelope containing a $10 banknote. Editor's note: there are comparatively few entries in the journal for this year. This was due to Mr. Emerson's occupation of severely pruning and refining for his book, Conduct of Life, the lectures which, as delivered, had much matter to hold the attention of lyceum audiences in the country at large. Mrs. Emerson remonstrated, missing good anecdotes and lighter touches, but her husband answered, "No, we must put on their Greek jackets for the book." The book was published at the end of the year, and Mr. Emerson sent copies to a long list of friends. Carlyle, in a letter acknowledging his copy, which for a moment drew him out of his Prussian nightmares of a hideous nature, wrote, quote, "I read it, with the satisfaction given me by the books of no other living mortal. I predicted to your English bookseller a great sale even, reckoning it the best of all your books. You have grown older, more pungent, piercing. I never read from you before such lightning gleams of meaning as are to be found here. The finale of all, that of illusions falling on us like snow showers, but again of the gods sitting steadfast on their thrones all the while. What a fiat lux is there into the depths of a philosophy which the vulgar has not, which hardly 3 men living have yet dreamt of. Well done, I say." End quote. End of note. This is the end of journal collection number 51, dating from the year 1860, when the author was 57 years old. Thank you for listening.